Welcome back to His 240, everyone. Let's jump right into today's explainer. Today, we're not just going to rattle off a timeline of events. We are diving into a period of massive existential shocks for Kentucky. We're talking about the 1930s and 40s, a really intense era where the Great Depression, violent labor wars, and World War II completely rewrote the psychological and political DNA of the Commonwealth.
So you gotta ask yourself a fundamental question here. How did a state that was historically defined by this fierce, almost rugged localism suddenly pivot to embrace massive federal control? Well, we're gonna frame this era not as a dry list of legislative dates, but as a profound philosophical pivot. The events of these 2 decades basically forced Kentuckians to completely rethink the relationship between the individual, their local community, and the national government. Let's start with Section 1, the collapse of localism. Okay, so before the 1930s, if you fell on hard times, you had to rely on local poor relief. This basically meant hoping county magistrates would grant you meager pennies, often based entirely on favoritism, or you'd get sent to a really dilapidated poorhouse. But by 1932, that highly localized system completely collapsed under the weight of a macroeconomic crisis. Just to put it in perspective, unemployment in Louisville hit a staggering 23.5% for white workers and an absolutely devastating 37.2% for black workers. The old county system simply could not handle a crisis on this scale. And it wasn't just the unemployment, it was this total systemic shattering of trust in local institutions. In 1930, a catastrophic drought slammed the agrarian economy, wiping out $100 million in crops. Then, the financial bedrock just cracked. Bank of Kentucky, which was literally the South's largest financial institution, totally collapsed. Even when banks eventually liquidated, everyday depositors lost an average of 40% of their life savings practically overnight. We're talking about medical workers in the Eastern Mountains documenting what they called a state of acute famine. So the big takeaway here is this. The utter collapse of these trusted local institutions perfectly primed Kentuckians for a radical change in governance. They were desperate for a lifeline. Which leads us to Section 2, the federal mental shift. Suddenly, you have Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal stepping in, and programs like the Works Progress Administration, the Civilian Conservation Corps, and the TVA rapidly transforming the physical landscape of Kentucky. Millions of federal dollars were suddenly pouring into the state to build roads, bridges, schools, and even sewer systems like the one you see here in Owensboro. This infrastructure push started breaking down decades of regional isolation. But we have to consider the visceral, human level of this too. Listen to what one woman from Henderson noted after her husband finally got a WPA job. She said, "First off, he bought us some groceries. Then he had a chance to get that little heating stove for $2 and some coal." That quote brilliantly captures how federal intervention wasn't just some abstract policy being debated in Washington. It meant literal survival. It meant eating. It meant staying warm during the winter. And this brings us to the highest level historical takeaway of this section. Yes, the New Deal completely changed Kentucky's physical landscape, but far more importantly, it changed its mind. Raw, desperate need completely overrode that old philosophy of strict localism. For the very first time on this kind of scale, Kentuckians broadly accepted that society, and specifically the federal government, had a fundamental role to play in an individual's well-being and economic stability. Moving on to Section 3, labor, capital, and violence. The 1930s also birthed the infamous legend of Bloody Harlan. Now, Harlan County had seen a massive population boom in the 1920s, cramming thousands of people into these deeply isolated coal camps. But when the Depression hit, coal prices absolutely tanked. Miners watched their pay drop from 81 cents a ton to a literal starvation wage of just 35 cents. And when those miners tried to organize, the coal operators responded with widespread evictions and hired armed deputies. It was unchecked corporate despotism that quickly devolved into open warfare, like the Battle of Everett, where thousands of shots were exchanged. This wasn't just an abstract struggle between labor and capital. It was a stark, starving reality for these families. As one Harlan County miner cried out, "We don't live, we just exist." Eventually, federal intervention arrived in the mountains too. The 1935 Wagner Act finally gave federal protection to unions, which allowed the United Mine Workers to secure actual contracts. For a lot of these folks, they literally divided their lives into two eras, before the Union and after the Union. But history is full of bitter irony, right? The federal government secured union rights, which was huge. But if you look at the numbers here, a crucial 1950 wage agreement by the National Union practically freed the coal companies to mechanize their operations. Check this out. In 1950, it took over 74,000 employees to mine 80 million tons of coal.
By 1995, production had nearly doubled to over 153 million tons, but it was being done by just 21,000 employees. So the hard-fought victory of labor rights inadvertently accelerated mass mechanization, destroying tens of thousands of jobs over the next few decades and forcing a massive migration out of the mountains. Section 4. Forging a new coalition. All this economic turmoil meant the New Deal didn't just build roads, it built a dominant new political machine. Historically, African Americans in Kentucky voted Republican. They were the party of Lincoln. Eastern coal miners also heavily leaned Republican. But as New Deal relief actively aided laborers and minority communities, a monumental demographic shift took place. These groups began migrating to the Democratic Party. This forged a new, incredibly broad and powerful Democratic coalition that would end up dominating state politics for the next 60 years. And right in the middle of this, you get this fascinating clash of political styles. On one side, you have the old backroom machine bosses. On the other, you have a newcomer named A.B. Happy Chandler. Chandler was something else. He used sheer charisma, this booming singing voice, and a highly personal theatrical campaign style to completely bypass those old political bosses. He was actually a fiscal conservative who streamlined state government, but his monumental ambition eventually led him to clash directly with FDR's handpicked Senate Majority Leader, Alben Barkley, in 1938. It was an epic showdown where the federal political machine and the state political machine went head-to-head. Finally, Section 5, the catalyst of global war. World War II essentially finished what the New Deal started. It ended the Great Depression and fundamentally broke Kentucky's isolation. The sheer scale of the home front transformation is just staggering when you look at it. 13% of the state's entire population migrated out to work in northern and western defense jobs. Severe labor shortages brought women into the industrial workforce in unprecedented numbers, including Pulaski County's Rose Monroe, who literally became the model for the iconic Rosie the Riveter film clips. The economy absolutely boomed, bringing per capita income up significantly, and over 300,000 Kentuckians entered the armed forces, scattering across the globe. This brings us to the core thesis of this entire era. As one Kentuckian so perfectly put it, we couldn't possibly have been the same person after the war that we were before because of what we did and what we saw. The crises of the 1930s and 40s permanently altered the psychology of the state. Kentuckians had seen the world. They had experienced federal economic security. They had seen women do the exact same industrial work as men. The old way of life, it was gone. Which leaves us with a really provocative question to think about for our next class. We have an entire generation of returning veterans, including African American soldiers, who just fought and defeated fascism abroad in the name of democracy. They have seen a wider, far more modernized world. So what is this newfound perspective going to mean for the deep, unresolved systemic issues waiting for them back home, particularly the institution of segregation? I want you to think about that tension, because it's exactly what we're going to unpack in our next explainer on the civil rights era in Kentucky. See you then.